Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast. Part 1 comes for free. You can listen to Part 2 by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. The decision to charge for the second half comes from our desire to maintain our independence.
Newspapers are absolutely everywhere, and that development is constantly echoed in Proust's novel, in the Recherche, which both recycles pieces of Proust's own journalism and journalism written by other people. He would take fragments and phrases and ideas in the press and rework them into the text of his novel. People are always talking about newspapers in the Recherche. They're always reading them, and the tone is set at the start of the novel when one of the central characters, Charles Swann, complains about the tedious newspapers, he says, that we feel obliged to read morning and evening.
Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast, an Irish home for independent journalism with a global perspective. The prophetess Cassandra advised her fellow Trojans to reject the horse the Greeks had seemingly left behind as a gift, but was ignored. Our Cassandra Voices podcast offers cautionary tales and inspiring narratives to illuminate our own troubled times. We'll be putting out regular episodes reflecting the broad scope of our magazine's coverage over the last 6 years. Thanks to the Loafing Heroes and especially Bartholomew Ryan for the use of their track Ro Goire from the 2019 album Meander Tales.
If a poet asked the state for the right to keep a few bourgeois in his stable, people would be most astonished. Yet if a bourgeois asked for a roasted poet, no one would bat an eyelid. That was Charles Baudelaire muttering away to himself in a posthumously published notebook. His bitter insight was also quoted by Max McGuinness during his recent end-of-term lecture for the French department of Trinity College Dublin. Max McGuinness is a teaching fellow in that language at that university. He previously taught at University College Dublin, the University of Limerick and Columbia University, where he received his PhD in French in 2019. His first book, just published this spring by Liverpool University Press, is Hustlers in the Ivory Tower, Press and Modernism from Mallarmé to Proust. This work, a distillation of a lifetime of interest in the overlapping areas it studies, explores how French modernist writers used the press as a forum for literary experimentation. Yet it achieves a great deal more than that, as we shall attempt to persuade you in the course of our conversation. The launcher of this book in Dublin, translator Pierre Guglielmina, gave a speech that resonated well. As we stood among the Irish curios of the Little Museum of Dublin, Pierre cleverly managed to nickname McGuinness's text with an accurate acronym, HIT IT. This at once provided an easy mnemonic for the first part of the title, and issued a tribute that sounds just like a piece of modernist wordplay. Pierre described HIT IT as a panorama of French literature from the Commune times of 1870 to the Great War of 1914, a study that, quote, hit him hard. The movement of Hit It, he asserted, from Mallarmé to Proust through Apollinaire, is a triumphant one, and I have been trying to understand why, he said. As for me, I get exactly how Pierre felt and recognised the kinetic excitement he alluded to, because for lovers of France, this is simply a period like none other. It is the crest of a cultural wave for French art and urbanism, for supreme works of design and technology, and for literary experimentation. In the background was an upsurge of mass literacy. It was a time when the newspaper was becoming, as McGuinness writes, a massified object as ubiquitous as bread and wine, a symbol of both the potential and the perils of mass media, and a newly voracious audience, a leviathan clamouring for fresh information and excitement, preferably the two at once. Somewhere in all that bustle, jostled by the crowd, endures the figure of the artist. All I ask of my cursed editor is to be left amuse myself as I please. That was Baudelaire again in La Solitude of 1869. McGuinness's work, already attracting serious attention in the rarefied world of French studies, is more than worthy of your attention. Please support our work at Cassandra Voices if you can by contributing the tiny subscription fee to hear the full content of our conversation. Thank you. Max McGuinness, thank you for speaking to Cassandra Voices.
Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today.
I have a quotation here that appears at the start of your book. Ainsi il va, il court, il cherche, que cherche-t-il? Would you like to continue this quotation and explain where it's from and why it's there?
Certainly. So this is a quotation from Charles Baudelaire's essay, The Painter of Modern Life, which was first published in the newspaper Le Figaro in 1863. I quote, "And so he goes on, running, searching. What is he looking for? Be quite certain that this man, as I have depicted him, this loner, blessed with an active imagination, forever travelling through the great desert of men, has a loftier goal than that of a pure flaneur, a goal more general than the fleeting pleasure of circumstance. He is searching for that something that you will permit me to call modernity, for no better word comes to mind to express the idea in question. For him, it is a matter of extracting from fashion whatever it contains that is poetic within the historic, of wresting the eternal from the transitory." So Baudelaire here is writing about a newspaper sketch artist who's largely otherwise forgotten, called Constantin Guy, who would produce sketches of world historical events like the Crimean War for a variety of publications such as the Illustrated London News. And Baudelaire dubs him the painter of modern life, even though he was more of a sketch artist than a painter in technical terms. And one word in particular becomes particularly important here, and that word is modernity. Baudelaire is struggling to formulate and get to grips with a new concept. Modernity, a word that is now familiar, but which was a new coinage at the time. Baudelaire didn't invent the word, but he was the first, probably the first, to try and theorize what he meant by it. And what does he mean by it? Well, he says that modernity is constituted of what is the eternal within the transitory. Modernity is about wresting the eternal from the transitory. And yet, a little later in the same essay, he offers another explanation that muddies the conceptual waters. Here he says that modernity, I quote, is the transitory, the fugitive, the contingent, one half of art whose other half is the eternal and immutable. So here we have a problem, right? Because he says that modernity is the eternal within the transitory, and then he says modernity is the transitory itself. He's having trouble getting to grips with this concept. He's having trouble explaining exactly what it is. Amid that conceptual quandary, Baudelaire's enthusiasm for Constantin Guy, the newspaper sketch artist's endeavors, stands out with resounding clarity. And what inspires him is not so much the formal quality of these now largely forgotten illustrations, so much as the activity underlying them. And that activity was journalism, complementing his already quasi-heretical salute to modernity, which was a word that was usually used with disparaging overtones. Baudelaire here is elevating Guy, the newspaper man, over studio artists whom he dismisses in the same essay as Hamlet brains. He is praising journalism, and that valorization of a devalued medium, journalism, supplies a material parallel to these theoretical vacillations about exactly what modernity is. For the medium of the newspaper is itself eternally caught up in a ceaseless quest for an uncertain, ever-changing commodity, the news, that loses its novelty and its value almost as soon as it is apprehended, almost as soon as we get to grips with it, whereupon the whole cycle begins again. And yet the newspaper simultaneously represents a putative locus of stability and collective identity, of permanence, of eternity, that purports to condense the life of the city, the nation, or indeed the world into a few unbound pages that both record and participate in history. At once ephemeral and eternal, the newspaper is not just the conceptual crucible of modernity, but also its most palpable metonym.
I'm excited by that too. If we zoom out and just look at the context in which Baudelaire is writing, it's a time of enormous flowering of literacy. In your introduction, you say, by 1914, total newspaper circulation exceeded 10 million copies, which I believe is daily.
Yeah, that's the figure for the total daily newspaper circulation in France, much higher than the same figure today. The population was considerably smaller. Obviously, that's for a population of 40 million people, and to which can be added all sorts of other publications and periodicals, which appeared on a weekly or monthly basis.
So we have this country, this major European power, that's reaching a kind of apogee of industrialization, also of education, and you have a huge new population that's consuming all of this material. And it's bound to cause anxiety to people who are masters of the word and the phrase. And this is what you go into so deeply in your book, this kind of counterpoint between rarefied aesthetic things and then the commonplace, the newspaper that had, you say, in half a century become a massified object as ubiquitous as bread and wine, a prominent object in Cubist still lives from the early 1910s. So the newspaper is really rising up out of the depths and becoming this heavy duty kind of presence in everyday life, and perhaps a threat to some people.
Throughout the 19th century, the newspaper was depicted in French literature as a threat, as a scourge, as a form of prostitution. Writers felt that journalism would be the death of literature. And yet, at the same time, the newspaper became what the French scholar Marie-Ève Terenty calls the laboratory of literature. So they were constantly railing against the press and writing novels of journalism that were themselves published in newspapers. And we find that in the work of authors such as Balzac, the Goncourt brothers, and Guy de Maupassant. In this book, in Hustlers in the Ivory Tower, Press and Modernism from Mallarmé to Proust, what I'm looking at is a shift that occurs towards the late 19th century, where some writers, while continuing to use the press as a literary laboratory, publishing works of prose fiction and poetry in newspapers and magazines, they start to reckon with that phenomenon more candidly. They confront their own creative debts to the press, and they take a more ambivalent attitude towards journalism. They recognize it as a fundamental part of the culture that is not going away, and they therefore seek to come to terms with the challenge posed by the rise of the press.
There's the phrase laboratory of literature, which comes into play. This followed this mass upheaval of literacy. It seems as if we're courting a new kind of vulgar mass readership, potentially. I enjoyed noting in the presentation of Baudelaire's opening quote there, but it appeared in Le Figaro, and just a few years later, Le Figaro went daily, which must have been a huge change, and then acquired this reputation. Le Figaro, which still exists in France, now this kind of conservative broadsheet, but it quickly acquired a reputation for gossip, more or less. this is emerging, this dilemma between high and low, between the ephemeral and the potentially permanent. And it's a very entrancing kind of dichotomy.
It's a dichotomy which the French modernists sought to overcome. They sought to bring together high and low culture within their writing. Low culture epitomized by the newspaper, by this devalued throwaway object, which was truly seen as the enemy of literature, rather than continue to deny its cultural importance and power, and rather than turn their backs on modernity, they judiciously sought to get to grips with the challenge posed to art and culture by incorporating it within their art, and by acknowledging that they were doing so within the works of fiction and poetry that emerged from that process. Works like Mallarmé's final collection of prose poetry, Divagation, Apollinaire's collection of poetry, Alcool, and then his second collection of visual poetry, Calligramme, which uses text and imagery and iconography culled from newspapers within the poems, and Proust's mammoth novel, À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time, which includes the text of an article that Proust himself had previously published in Le Figaro, in the same newspaper, and which triggers a creative epiphany within the story. It is the experience of publishing an article in that newspaper, in Le Figaro, which catalyzes the hero's artistic vocation in Proust's research, which is also incidentally a novel, or at least the first volume of that novel, Swann's Way, is dedicated to the editor of Le Figaro, Gaston Calmette, who had encouraged Proust's early literary inclinations and had published many articles by him in Le Figaro. You mentioned earlier Le Figaro's reputation for gossip. Indeed, shortly after Proust published Swann's Way, which is dedicated to Gaston Calmette, Gaston Calmette was shot dead by Henriette Caillot, the wife of a prominent French politician, Joseph Caillot. Why did she do that? She did so because Calmette had been waging a scurrilous campaign against Caillot, which drew on his private correspondence. Henriette Caillot was Joseph Caillot's second wife, had been his mistress, and she was so enraged by the way in which Calmette was peering into their private lives and splashing it on the front page that she went into his office and shot him. She was then controversially acquitted of that murder during the weeks leading up to the outbreak of the First World War. And in the weeks leading up to that was in July 1914, that was a bigger story in the Parisian press than the imminent war.
The shooting of the Archduke, another assassination.
But Henriette Caillot's trial actually dominated coverage more so than the July crisis itself.
That's another trial, and I hope we can touch on some significant ones that occur peppered across this landscape. They're very interesting thematic. But one wondrous thing I often feel you can say about artists is that they can move back and forth in time and space. But writers in particular, how because they're taking on board the challenge of narrative through time, they can move you and their characters back and forth in time. And Proust does this with an internal process, unlike maybe anyone else, trying to go back into time and recover it. In that vein, though, we've gone all the way from the 1860s to 1914. Now I'm going to go back again, with your permission, because I found an essay that you make some use of by Marshall McLuhan that attracted me. It does a few things. This essay is called Joyce, Mallarmé and the Press, and it ends up being an affirmation of Joyce, which isn't so much the concern here. But I like the way it begins and the way it closes. It goes back into the start of the same century where Hit comes in at the climax of the same century. And McLuhan sets the scene by quoting Lamartine, and the year is 1830. And he's writing to his editor, I believe, to turn down the opportunity to publish in a Revue Européenne. Do not perceive in these words a superb disdain for what is termed journalism. Far from it, I have too intimate a knowledge of my epoch to repeat this absurd nonsense. I know too well the work Providence has committed to it. Before this century shall run out, journalism will be the whole press, the whole human thought. Thought will be spread abroad in the world with the rapidity of light, instantly conceived, instantly written, instantly understood at the extremities of the earth. It will spread from pole to pole, sudden, instant, burning with the fervour of soul which made it burst forth. It will be the reign of the human soul in all its plenitude. It will not have time to ripen, to accumulate in a book. The book will arrive too late. The only book possible from today is a newspaper. I think that's incredible. It's like a kind of futurism. It's like something outrageous from the early 19th century trying to talk about how telegraphs will take over. But it seems then in the 1830s, there's already a sense that journalism was engulfing this ivory tower. I know Hitted is more concerned with the end of the century, but that sensation, I think you argue, was even more pronounced, and you're dealing with that struggle.
By the end of the 19th century, this was an absolute commonplace. The idea that the newspaper would kill off the book, and that the book was perhaps already dead, that the novel was dead as a genre. Indeed, in the 1890s, at a time when newspaper circulation was rapidly expanding, the book trade was in crisis, and sales of books were faltering. Writers were in despair about the way in which journalism, and particularly a particular form of journalism, reporting, seemed to be crowding out imaginative writing, seemed to be crowding out poetry, prose, fiction. So this is a constant preoccupation throughout the 19th century. What distinguishes Mallarmé, Stéphane Mallarmé, the poet, Guillaume Apollinaire, who came along slightly later, and Marcel Proust, among other modernists, is that they break with that doxa, rather than fulminate against the newspaper as the death of literature. They bring the newspaper into literature. They fuse these two forms of writings to create a daring new synthesis of the different media of newspaper and book. Mallarmé indeed aspired to create what he called the great work, or le livre, the book, with a capital L, which would, he believed, be forged within the newspaper and would yield a new medium that harnessed the most dynamic properties of newspaper and book, and would even form the basis of a new civic religion grounded in poetry. Mallarmé saw his contemporaries reading newspapers almost obsessively. He saw the enthusiasm that was generated by newspapers among ordinary people, and how this medium could bring poetry to the people and fill a spiritual vacuum that he perceived at the heart of the French Third Republic that was founded at the beginning of the 1870s. Now, that grand vision is utopian and was not ever truly realized within Mallarmé's own writing. He nonetheless, shortly before his death in 1898, he authored a poem, Un coup de dé jamais n'abolira le hasard, a throw of the dice never shall abolish chance, which is one of the great monuments of modernist literature. It's a poem where the text is fragmented and stretched across the page in ways that clearly emulate newspaper typography, and it's a poem where the themes themselves dramatize the conflict between literature and journalism, between art and the frivolity associated with journalism. And that poem, A Throw of the Dice, was intended as the first installment in this mysterious unfinished book that Mallarmé projected as the salvation of French civilization itself.
You've just killed Mallarmé, and I lost my chance. But could you reverse time's arrow, if you would, and just for people who do not know who Stéphane Mallarmé was, sketch his life briefly from the start up to that climax.
Mallarmé was born in Paris in 1842, and he became a poet at a young age. He was also a school teacher. He taught English in a series of lycées. He wasn't, by most accounts, a particularly effective English teacher, and he was eager to spend as little time in the classroom as he possibly could. And he became the central figure within a movement known as symbolism, which sought to stretch the boundaries of language, to break with linguistic convention in order to capture the deeper currents of human experience and emotion and feeling that weren't necessarily present within the dominant realist modes of writing at the time. And most of those symbolists, and including Mallarmé himself at various points, viewed the press as their enemy. But over time, Mallarmé came to adopt this more ambivalent and ultimately enthusiastic vision of journalism as a source of literary renewal. He moves on from the reflexive hostility towards the press and the way in which he saw it as corrupting civilization, in order to espouse this bold, radical vision of a new hybrid form that will bring together a book and newspaper.
Mallarmé is the focus of the first chapter, and I think we'll come back to him and his rapturous synthesis that you mentioned. The second chapter, which I particularly enjoyed, it brings us deeper into the realm of these revues. So you have a kind of flowering of different publications, different formats. We're talking about experimentation. I think it's worth underlining, not just in literary form and things that you can publish now in a book and they'd still be extraordinary, but also the way things were published in these magazines and so on. And some of them must have been striking to read in archive. I wanted to ask him, we may not know much, but what do we know about the buyers and the readers of these magazines? Let's say the distinction Petite Revue and Grande Revue.
So when we talk about revue, I mean, we're referring to a magazine. During the 19th century, initially these grandes revues emerged. The Revue des Deux Mondes, which is still published today, is probably the leading one. And so the grandes revues are more conservative establishment publications, which had many subscribers. The Revue des Deux Mondes in the 1870s had around 25,000 subscribers. They were also very financially successful enterprises. And by the 1880s, there was a sense that these grandes revues were closed off to new ideas and new literary forms. And because of the introduction of a new press law, which abolished most forms of censorship and other restrictions which had been imposed on the French press up to that point, a new wave of petites revues, of little magazines, started to flower, and there were hundreds of them, and these were created by groups of young poets. They typically had much lower circulations, although in time the more successful ones actually acquired considerable readerships. So I'm talking about publications such as La Revue Blanche, La Plume, the Cahiers de la Quinzaine, edited by Charles Péguy, and eventually La Nouvelle Revue Française, which is still published today, and which became the Gallimard publishing house, which is the leading publishing house, leading literary publishing house in France today. That was formed out of the the little magazine, La Nouvelle Revue Française. So these were a new literary laboratory, a new place of poetic experimentation, which typically defined themselves against the mass press, against the newspapers and the Grande Revue, which they believed had become entirely closed off to literary experimentation and new ideas. However, this is one of the central arguments of the book of Hustlers in the Ivory Tower. There were actually many more connections between those Petites Revues and the Grande Revue than has been acknowledged. That for the Petite Revue to survive and the ones that became successful and attained a degree of longevity, it was essential to obtain publicity in the mass press, and they actively courted publicity in newspapers and Grande Revue in ways which were a little surreptitious, in which they didn't tend to admit. Moreover, Mallarmé's poem, which we were talking about just there, a throw of the dice, was in fact published in a Grande Revue, in an establishment publication called Cosmopolis, rather than a Petite Revue. And there were a lot of writers who contributed at once to newspapers and to Grande Revue and little magazines. The little magazines couldn't usually pay their contributors much, if anything. So these writers they relied upon the money they could earn writing for newspapers and larger circulation magazines. The Petite Revue tended to be read by younger writers, and probably a lot of students. We don't have a lot of data about exactly who these readers were, but it can be assumed that the readership skewed towards younger people and towards the members of these literary schools themselves, such as symbolism and décadence. Grande Revue had a more conservative bourgeois readership, representing a broader set of broader range of Parisian society at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of it's counterintuitive. For instance, as I discovered in greater preparation, I would have thought that the Petite Revue were upstarts with little financial backing. And yes, upstart and disruptive, that's correct. I thought of them as a bit like startups with nowadays, with a kind of huge failure rate, and then the ones that survive end up with a decent subscriber base, and you can somewhat true. I was curious about what kind of financial barrier might have been there for people wanting to enter the space. But as is often the case in the startup world too, it turns out that some of the founders of the Petite Revue already were people of means or offspring of people with means, and they were able to in some ways rely on that potential safety net as they launched their precarious literary enterprise. Is that fair enough to say?
This is true. The initial barriers to entry were low. For example, one of the first Petite Revues called the Mercure de France, which was created in 1889, and the first issue cost 125 francs to publish, and that, if you multiply by 4 or 5, you get the equivalent figure in euros today. So it costs about 500 or 600 euros to publish the first issue, and that was possible for a group of young writers and poets, and they clubbed together in order to launch the magazine. And then over time, thanks to the commercial acumen of its editor Alfred Valette, Mercure de France became a successful business. That particularly because of its success in branching out into book publishing, and they published a number of bestsellers. This publishing house continues to exist today, the Édition du Mercure de France. In other cases, the little magazines did rely on subsidy from patrons and from the publishers and editors themselves. These publishers and editors were often the sons of bankers, industrialists, and merchants who had enriched themselves during the 19th century. A new bourgeois leisure class. Many of them were Jewish or Protestant, to marginal groups within French society who had undergone much discrimination, as the Dreyfus affair would illustrate in the case of the French Jewish community. But they're nonetheless moving towards the center of French society, and so it's appropriate that they should have been associated with this new, initially marginal form of publication, the Petite Revue, the little magazine, which would, over the next 3 to 4 decades, in fact, reinvent the French literary world, reinvent French literary publishing, and become the dominant force. And that transformation is encapsulated by the way in which La Nouvelle Revue Française starts as this little magazine created by André Gide, among others, and eventually becomes the powerhouse of Édition Gallimard, which remains the most prestigious literary publishing house in France today.
You alluded, you sketched out earlier an extraordinary story. The audience might even want to rewind and replay that Byzantine kind of conflict between publisher and his wife's lover, and ended up in an assassination. That was one story. And I think there are, many fascinating ones in the book. Perhaps you could go and zoom in on some other kind of interweaving history of rivalry and or collaboration or love or hate. Some kind of anecdote that will illuminate this emerging pattern between art and the press and parts of society.
Mm-hmm. Well, one example would be rather melodramatic turn of events that took place within La Revue Blanche, which was one of the leading Petite Revue, the White Revue. Perhaps best remembered today for the poster art created by Pierre Bonnard and Toulouse-Lautrec that served to advertise that magazine. The magazine was set up by a group of Jewish brothers, the Natanson brothers, and Tadé Natanson's wife, Misia Sert, became the mistress of a newspaper publisher, a certain Alfred Edwards, a sulphurous figure who founded a newspaper called Le Matin, which became one of the leading popular daily newspapers in France, selling over 1 million copies at its height. And so Certes left Tadé Natanson, the editor, one of the editors of La Revue Blanche, to become the wife of Alfred Edwards, who would also employ Tadé Natanson as a journalist on one of his newspapers. So these are milieux which have typically been portrayed as separate. The mass press on the one hand, and the Petite Revue on the other, two separate poles of the literary field. And yet here we have an example of the kind of intimate connections that actually bound them together on a personal level. One of the works that I discuss in detail in the book is Félix Fénéon's Nouvelles en 3 lignes, which can be either translated as news stories in 3 lines or novels in 3 lines. This is a column to which Félix Fénéon contributed in the newspaper owned by Alfred Edwards, Le Matin, where he would take pieces of news in brief, reports of accidents and crime stories, and he would turn them into these eerie haiku-like fragments in 3 lines, which are often infused with subversive political overtones. Le Matin was a politically conservative newspaper. Félix Fénéon was a former anarchist militant who had been tried and acquitted for blowing up a restaurant during the 1890s. Whether he did or did not plant the bomb is unclear. I'm inclined to believe he didn't. In any event, this Fénéon had been the primary editor of La Revue Blanche, and when La Revue Blanche closed, and when he needed a job, it was Misia Certes, by now Alfred Edwards' wife, the former wife of his colleague Thaddée Nathanson, who got him that job on Le Matin, and a newspaper where he was able to go against the grain of that newspaper's own editorial line in order to rewrite these news stories in ways that were in line with his own political preoccupations.
The Nouvelle en Trois Lignes, I mean, this is famously making use of faits divers. Is that correct?
The fait divers is a category used in French journalism to describe pieces of news in brief, which are generally dismal. It's usually murders, accidents, other quotidian horrors. One of Fénéon's Nouvelle en Trois Lignes, for instance, describes the suicide of a man in his 60s, and then it concludes with the description of the sign that he hung around his own neck: "Trop vieux pour travailler," too old to work. Right?
My God!
So we see there how Fénéon is sneaking in his own political ideas into this reactionary newspaper. It's an example. So Le Matin was seen as a publication that was hostile to literary experimentation as well as political radicalism. Fénéon is like a secret agent within that publication who manages to infiltrate its columns and with these unsigned news stories does so discreetly and surreptitiously. It's an example of how even within what might have appeared to be the stoniest of journalistic soil, eclectic forms of literary flourishing were possible.
Marcel Proust is a huge figure for you. You organized a conference, the Irish Proust, and he then starts to loom large, of course, in the book. And if we're following a sort of timeline, although we've jumped ahead perhaps a little, I was interested to see Proust's birth date, 1871. Obviously, this is a crucial time for France. This is almost back to the beginning of your timeline. But I thought it'd be a good point in the conversation to go in on his life as a framing device. What was happening in France in 1871, and following from that, what were Proust's formative years like? Perhaps go through his life a little and into the next century.
So Proust was born in July 1871 in Auteuil, on the outskirts of Paris, during the Paris Commune, the short-lived revolutionary government that developed in Paris at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, or after the Franco-Prussian War, which ended in military humiliation for France, and which was the Commune itself was then brutally crushed by French government forces. So that marks the end of a long period of turbulence in France since the French Revolution of 1789, punctuated by a whole series of revolutions and different forms of government. France swings back and forth between monarchy and republic and empire. But then, starting in 1870, this long period of stability and peace and prosperity begins, which continues up to the beginning of the First World War in 1914. And and this is the period where newspaper civilization really takes hold, and it's reflected in the circulation figures. So when Proust is born in 1871, total newspaper circulation in France is around 1.5 million copies per day. It increases sevenfold within Proust's lifetime. So what had been a relatively expensive item consumed by a metropolitan elite becomes a truly mass phenomenon. Newspapers are absolutely everywhere, and that development is constantly echoed in Proust's novel, in the Recherche, which both recycles pieces of Proust's own journalism and journalism written by other people. He would take fragments and phrases and ideas in the press and rework them into the text of his novel. People are always talking about newspapers in the Recherche. They're always reading them, and the tone is set at the start of the novel when one of the central characters, Charles Swann, complains about the tedious newspapers. He says that we feel obliged to read morning and evening, and then he comes up with a novel suggestion. He says what we should do. He says we should take the contents of the newspaper and we should swap them with the contents of a really important book, like Pascal's Pensées, 17th century philosopher. We should swap them around so that then when we read the newspaper, we would be reading something really important. Whereas these books, which we leave on our shelves, which we never open, they would contain all the trivial stuff that we spend our days consuming in newspapers, reports of balls and what the various aristocrats and the king and queen of Spain were up to. Right? So this is Swann being witty in front of the hero's family, but it actually prefigures what is going on in Proust's novel, where Proust actually takes the material from the newspaper and he puts it into his book, into a book which itself, because of its length and difficulty, is often left on the shelf in a guiltily forgotten position. And but that book is full of what the French press describes as mondanité, of accounts of high society life, which have been transformed by Proust into a great work of art, because Proust understood that nothing was in fact too trivial for a true artist, and that's a central feature of Proust's novel, where the most humble and insignificant experiences, hence the famous Madeleine dipped in tea, are what truly merits the attention of the artist. Among those seemingly trivial and humble details is a great deal of journalism, which Proust transformed into literature, including his own early journalism. Notably, an article that he wrote about crossing Normandy in an automobile in 1907, which he had published in Le Figaro, a piece of prose poetry almost, which describes the steeples of Caen as experienced in an automobile, and that the text of that article is reframed within Proust's novel, where it takes on an ambiguous status. It's at once a devalued piece of juvenilia, and it is the trigger for his artistic, for the hero's artistic vocation. It is by experiencing journalism and reflecting on its flaws as well as its aesthetic virtues that Proust is able to author his novel.
What you are listening to has taken time and resources to prepare. It is a collaboration of committed journalists. Please, if you can, share, subscribe, or support this podcast in whatever way you can.
It's beautiful. I won't make any jokes about reports of bulls, but I want to ask about the anxiety of these intrusive reporters who come along and maybe expose your secrets, because I'm not familiar enough with the research to go into it in great detail. But I'm intrigued by the drama in it, whereby I think is he called the Baron de Charlus,
he is really the stand-in for the homosexual anxieties and these kinds of themes, and the fear that this new kind of presence, as it must have been in French life, the reporter, could kind of expose your secrets. It seems to have been an important, the trial of Oscar Wilde as well seems to have been an important kind of shadow within the novel. Proust alludes to it or includes it. And so how does that kind of thing work? Instead of the sense of redemption, synthesis and attainment, do the newspapers not also represent a kind of threat to a delicate bourgeois kind of life?
In the research, Proust alludes to the downfall of Oscar Wilde without naming Wilde, but the description of him as this
English writer.
This once he doesn't actually specify his nationality, but he alludes to a hitherto celebrated playwright who in the London theatre, who has been chased away and disgraced. It's clearly Wilde, even if the Wilde himself is not specified or it's not named directly. And this does relate to the way in which Wilde's trial was extensively reported in the French press, the press across Europe, and Proust must have read those reports of Wilde's trial, and as argued in the forthcoming volume that I'm currently editing on the Irish Proust, about Proust's influence on Irish literature, as well as Irish themes within Proust's own writing. There's a chapter by Elizabeth Leightonson of Columbia University who argues that Wilde represents a terrifying counter-example of exposure in the press, of being outed in the press, and how that could destroy your life. Proust was clearly deeply anxious that such a thing could happen to him, hence the many coded representations of homosexuality in the research, and his efforts to put distance between himself and his hero and narrator by making the hero and narrator heterosexual rather than a homosexual. So this was the power that the press had. It could ruin you, as it had ruined Joseph Caillot and his wife Henriette. And Proust was deeply aware of the power of the press, and one way in which he turned that to his advantage was by working hard and with great skill to orchestrate publicity on behalf of his novel within newspapers. He got his friends to write articles praising Swann's Way when it was published in 1913. He also paid bribes to newspapers to insert puff pieces about his novel that he had written himself. And this publicity campaign was altogether successful. The Swann's Way, a novel of considerable length and difficulty, had sold around 3,000 copies by the outbreak of war in 1914, so around a year after its publication. And that was an impressive commercial performance. And it represented that reflected Proust's his promotional acumen, his ability to hustle. Right? He knew how to sell his book, and he worked closely with his publisher, Grasset, in order to make that happen. So that one of the central themes of my book is how Hustlers in the Ivory Tower is the way in which writers such as Proust managed to reconcile artistic independence with the earthier side of literature, the need to promote yourself, to promote your work, to hustle, to get your name in the papers. This is something that writers such as Proust were skilled at, and they understood how important it was, and it also becomes a theme throughout their writing itself in a self reflexive manner. The dark arts of publicity are a recurring metaphor in Proust's novel. He was deeply aware of the necessity of self-promotion in order to bring his book to the world.
And at risk of seeming pathetic again, I don't want to insult Marcel and his achievement in doing all of that without meeting that catastrophic exposure that did seem to cause him anxiety. I'm also reminded of the other secondary meaning for the word hustle, connected to prostitution, which is an important theme for you at certain moments. Flaubert calling journalism Luperon, was it?
It's Balzac.
Balzac.
Yeah. So in Lost Illusions, which is the first novel of journalism, Balzac inaugurates this trope of journalism as a form of prostitution. One of the characters describes newspapers as ces lupanards de la pensée. So lupanar, whorehouse. So these whorehouses of thought, and that trope is recycled throughout much 19th century literature. It becomes very repetitive, and it's a rather sexist and self-pitying metaphor. The modernists who come later in late 19th century, particularly Mallarmé and Apollinaire, they move away from that. They stop portraying journalism in this repetitive way as a form of prostitution. They start to think about the ways in which journalism itself has creative potential, the way in which it had shaped their own writing. Proust, in his novel, does obliquely reprise this metaphor of journalism as prostitution, but he does so ambiguously. He describes journalistic writing as being la Vénus des carrefours, so the Venus of the crossroads. Venus has a double meaning. It's both a beautiful woman or an object, but it can also refer to a prostitute, as in that expression la Vénus des carrefours, which actually, that la Vénus des carrefours actually comes from Balzac. In Proust, he describes journalistic writing as a broken Venus, right? One which possesses a certain form of beauty, but which has been disfigured by the process of journalistic publications. We see there the kind of self-reflexive ambivalence that characterizes Proust's relationship with the press, with journalism. He resists the dominance of the press, but he does not reject it. He recognizes it as a part of the fabric of his work and of his self, and one that it is necessary to reckon with as part of the creation of his work of art.
Is it the case that he himself did appear in a fait divers when police raided a male brothel and found him with some other men actually just sitting around a table having a little drink of champagne, and so not engaging in the Luperon activities, but that he was picked up, maybe questioned or arrested, and his name did briefly appear in some kind of reportage?
I'm not sure about this, but an incident of that kind did happen, but I don't think it was reported in the press. No.
Okay.
There was a raid on a brothel, and some scholars in France have pieced that together some years ago, based on a diary that Proust kept, which was rediscovered, the so-called 1906 diary. There are allusions to that incident in the diary, but I don't think it was reported in the press.
That's good to know. I'm not trying to make more of a newsflash of it than it needs to be, but I did think it was poignant. There was an exhibition on in Paris featuring that raid and bits of evidence. Interesting that he himself was kind of, I think Baron de Charlus does something a little similar at some point in the book, but he's sort of occupying a voyeur role. He's in the back room, kind of content to be close to something scandalous, but not actively participating.
No, it's the narrator who is the voyeur in the brothel scene, who's watching Charlus
getting whipped.
So Charlus, he's watching Charlus through a keyhole being whipped with chains. Okay. Even in that episode, there is a journalistic pun. Okay. So one of the characters quips that he's like l'homme enchaîné, so which is an allusion to a newspaper edited by Georges Clemenceau at the time.
Nothing to
And
do
then, of
with
course,
Canard.
well, I don't know. I don't think there's a connection to the Canard enchaîné, but it's as far as I recall, there was another newspaper with a similar title edited by Clemenceau, which had been censored at some point during the war. So we see the way in which journalism ends up shaping everyday conversation at regular intervals.
Absolutely. So do you mind if we shift tack?
By all means,
and
shift.
Move towards your motivations in creating this work? When did you first become aware of journalism as something that was pregnant with an aesthetic potential? Clearly, you enjoy these characters from the 19th century, trying to connect the two. I think you yourself must obviously be interested in the kind of eternal problem or potential.
I think probably when I was a teenager, around the age of 14 or 15, I started to read journalism pretty intensively when I was in school, in the rec room. There would be newspapers there, particularly the Guardian during the heyday of Alan Rusbridger's editorship. And I remember reading writers like Hugo Young or Ian Jack or Lynn Barber. There was a sort of level of erudition and acuity to their analysis, or a color to their prose style, which seemed very appealing. And they seemed to be having a lot of fun as well. Robert Fisk was another journalist I remember reading a lot at that time, particularly in the Independent. There was a sense of dynamism to these publications, the Independent of those days, and the Guardian, which gave me the impression that journalism itself has literary qualities, and it allows you to both write and engage with the world and be part of a wider world. It provided that window onto the world at a time when I myself was quite cut off. Later, I remember when I was quite young, reading a book of journalism by Joseph Roth, the Austrian writer-journalist. The collection published by Grant, I think, is entitled "What I Saw," and it's a collection of newspaper articles that he published during the 1920s and 1930s, traveling around Europe, noting, always looking at what's going on at the side of the bigger picture. His reports were not about high politics. He would find a way of telling a political story by focusing on the people that no one else is paying attention to. Maybe a barber, or the attendees at a major public funeral, or the so-called wandering Jews that he encountered in ghettos around Europe, and Roth was writing in the tradition of the feuilleton, which was the name given to the literary section of a French newspaper, and which was then imported into the German-speaking press. And still today, the French word feuilleton is used to describe the cultural section of of German newspapers, but it's not used in France anymore to the same extent. And then later, when I was doing my undergraduate degree, I was studying Baudelaire, and I had to write a tutorial essay late at night about Baudelaire's prose poetry, and it was getting very late indeed, and I didn't really know what to say. And I started going through the footnotes, and I realized that the Baudelaire's prose poems had, in most cases, been first published in newspapers. And there was one in particular called La Presse. Baudelaire published over 20 prose poems in that newspaper in 1862. And what's more is he did not publish his prose poems as a book during his lifetime. That came to me as a revelation that the form of literature in historical terms was very different to the one we know today. That these these were scrappy productions that were cobbled together, published in newspapers, cut and edited in many cases. Although Baudelaire was very reluctant to see even a comma being removed. They were not. His prose poems were nonetheless jammed together within the feuilleton of La Presse at the bottom of the front page, and this was a major daily newspaper. So that was an exciting discovery for me, which in time led to a PhD in French on this subject, and ultimately this book, Hustlers in the Ivory Tower, Press of Modernism from Mallarmé to Proust. So I suppose it's a process whereby I began being very interested in journalism itself during the early part of this century, and reading a lot of newspapers, and then working backwards towards the history of journalism and how it was deeply intertwined with poetry and prose fiction during the 19th century in France. Indeed, prose poetry as a genre, as a form, was created in the newspaper. It emerged. The first examples of prose poetry, including Baudelaire's Petit Poème en prose, the little poems in prose, also known as the Paris Spleen. Those were published in newspapers, and it's the brevity of the form and the lack of meter reflect the constraints of journalistic publication. Baudelaire says this directly in the dedication at the start of Le Spleen de Paris to the proprietor of that newspaper, La Presse, where he says that these prose poems, this new form, offers us admirable conveniences because we can cut wherever we like. The reader in turn can read a bit and then move on, drop the newspaper and pick it up again if he feels like doing so. And this comes back to what we were talking about earlier with respect to modernity. This form of prose poetry is created as a way of trying to bring literature into line with modernity, to help it, to allow it to try and capture the constant impermanence of modern life, the fragmentation of modern life, the kind of shattered attention spans, which people were complaining about in the 19th century, in the same way we complain about what the internet and iPhones and digital technology are doing to us. We find exactly the same thought throughout 19th century writing. The fact that newspapers have displaced the book, or the idea that newspapers have displaced the book, and that they are ruining us culturally. They are ruining our attention spans. No one can concentrate anymore. Baudelaire's writing is a response to that, and rather than simply moaning about that development, he makes it a central theme of his writing, and he creates a new literary form, the prose poem, that allows him to come to terms with the rise of newspaper civilization. He harnesses its energy to his own creative ends.
And Baudelaire's framing in his essay that brings us the modernity concept, framing of an artist who essentially was making, we consider him a newspaper sketch artist. It reminds me of the other aesthetic felicity in journalism. You mentioned this kind of brevity, the kind of fragmentariness that can be great for dealing with modern life. I was thinking also of the visual, the way that papers just present us with images, and then the caption, crucially, these kinds of juxtapositions, kind of unlike anything else. Illustrated books, illuminated manuscripts, so none of it quite cuts it. It is quite odd to confront images in the way you do. The French papers to this day, they talk about la une, the cover, and you have a dense variety of strange things like caricatures, every kind of splashy tabloid thing up to something much more elevating. You yourself used to love, I think, photography Henri Cartier-Bresson, and this side of photo reportage, which can capture things very beautifully.
But it's interesting you bring up photography because it's the subject of Baudelaire's essay, the painter of modern life, is a little paradoxical. It was a newspaper sketch artist called Constantin Guy, who's identified only by his initials in the essay CG. But this was at the dawn of photography. Photography was already around at the time and was already being used for journalistic purposes. So Guy is perhaps best remembered, aside from his appearance in Baudelaire's essay, for his sketches of the Crimean War. The photojournalism was also a feature of the Crimean War. So even as Baudelaire is celebrating modernity and this new modern condition of constant impermanence and volatility, the example he chooses seems to belong to the past. He is a sketch artist. He's using the traditional technique of the sketch rather than photography. And Baudelaire was largely antipathetic to the new form of photography. He didn't like it. So what Baudelaire and the other modernists are trying to do is they're trying to strike a balance between tradition and innovation. That is the essence of modernism, in contrast to what's called the avant-garde, which tends to involve a forthright rejection of tradition. And so the futurists, led by F.T. Marinetti, for instance, they were unambivalently enthusiastic about the rise of the press. They saw journalism and the newspaper as replacements for the book. They celebrated that idea. They were not reticent about it. Whereas what Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Apollinaire, and Proust are doing is that they are trying to preserve the best of the past, but combine it with a jolt of innovation, a jolt of modernity, in order to transcend that opposition between the past and the present, and to reconcile the two, to create works of art that are truly eternal and that transcend their own times whilst capturing the spirit of their times.
You worked, I think, as a columnist, is that right, for a kind of petit review, if we could call it that, at least a startup publication, an ambitious young publication called the Dubliner magazine. Can you describe what that was like?
So the Dubliner was a monthly cultural magazine that existed for around 10 years, from around 2001 to maybe 2012 or 2013. And it did have the flavor of a petite revue in some respects. It was less focused on literature, but it was open to experimentation, in the sense that you could write almost whatever you wanted there about a wide range of subjects, not limited to what was going on in Dublin. And it was always a very precarious enterprise as well. So the material struggles of little magazines are echoed in the history of the Dubliner. And I wrote a monthly column there for 3 or 4 years, as well as a blog for a period. And I think what it shared with the little magazines of late 19th, early 20th century France was precisely this openness, this willingness to entertain all sorts of ideas about what you could write about. It was not a publication that imposed a firm sense of order. It did not dictate what you could write about, and the content of each issue would fluctuate dramatically. It was an eternal work in progress.
Do you remember the atmosphere of the Dubliner offices?
I do. I didn't spend that much time there because I lived mostly in England at the time. But again, there was I suppose a lot of banter and a lot of chat and a lot of hanging around and shooting the breeze, which is what one can imagine to have been the case in the little magazines of Paris, where there are relatively few sources. There's some diaries which give us a flavor of what the atmosphere was like in those offices, but it was.
Would you have been climbing the stairs to? Would you have been climbing the stairs to kind of grenier to find those offices, or would they have been better heeled, living in the kind of more stately rooms?
It depends. Most of the Petite Revue, their offices were located in the Latin Quarter, so a more bohemian district. In those days, it was a bohemian student district. But perhaps the leading Petite Revue of the era, La Revue Blanche, which we've already talked about. Now, that stands out because its offices came to be located in the heart of the traditional newspaper district on the right bank around Les Grands Boulevards and near the Bourse, near the stock exchange. And that is important to understanding why La Revue Blanche became a publication that was able to straddle both worlds, both the world of the mass press and the world of little magazines, and became a particularly important political voice during the Dreyfus affair in the 1890s. La Revue Blanche became a major Dreyfus organ, one of the first publications to campaign on behalf of Dreyfus. It did so in collaboration with newspaper journalists, particularly the novelist Octave Mirbeau, who published a serial novel in La Revue Blanche at the time, which referred to the Dreyfus affair in real time as it was unfolding. I'm referring to his novel Le Journal d'une femme de chambre, the diary of a chambermaid.
Famous, yeah.
I think what maybe the broader point which stands out here is that the forms of media that are particularly exciting are those that manage to bring together different worlds that sit that lie in an interstitial position between worlds that otherwise seem opposed, and that's what La Revue Blanche in particular managed to do, and that's why it is the Petite Revue which is best remembered, which yielded the most innovative and now canonical works of literature by writers including Mallarmé, as well as Alfred Jarry. I've already mentioned Octave Mirbeau. La Revue Blanche had a foot in both camps. It had a foot in the mass press, and it had a foot in the world of niche modernist publications. It was both at the same time.
I was intrigued to learn that even though you have here a burgeoning sense of being able to use journalism to influence art, and perhaps vice versa, and interbreed them, interweave them and stuff, you had people who were interested in the wider world. We might call it the colonial world, certainly a place where the French colonial empire was casting a big shadow. But many of these people actually didn't really leave France. We're not surprised to know that Proust didn't journey very far. That wasn't the way his mind worked. Baudelaire went on one little voyage on a boat, but got sick and immediately went home and spent his life claiming that he had journeyed the Orient. But there's this theme where, and you underlined this, fascinatingly, people were back in France picking up on first-hand accounts from overseas and writing them into their works, and sometimes doing morality with it, maybe sometimes being exploratory with it. You yourself, actually, unlike some of those people, you appeared just at the moment of a coup d'etat in Africa, in Togo, and ended up doing reports on that for RTE. Is that correct?
I did. That was one of my first journalistic experiences. So I happened to be in the West African country of Togo, actually teaching English at the time when the dictator, Gnassingbé Edema, died suddenly, and the army launched a coup d'etat in order to put his son in power for Gnassingbé, who remains the president today. It was, I suppose, an example of how when you find yourself on the spot when his history is unfolding in front of you, you can write home about it. And it was exciting to phone up the Irish Times and RTE and say, look, this coup is happening. Do you want? No, I don't think there are any other journalists here. Do you want me to write about it? And I did. And then they published the article. The Petite Revue in Paris, the 19th century, didn't necessarily have the same ease of communication within the colonies, but there was one magazine in particular, the Cahiers de la Quinzaine, edited by Charles Péguy. And by the way, if we subsequently have publications with titles like Les Cahiers du Cinéma, the great magazine of cinema criticism, edited by François Truffaut in the 1950s and 60s. That's a nod to the title of Peggy's magazine, the Cahiers de la Quinzaine, the Cahiers, the copybooks. Anyway, the Cahiers de la Quinzaine became a central voice of perhaps not anti-colonialism, but of criticism of colonialism and of the crimes that were being perpetrated in France's empire. Péguy had a great knack for finding people who were there and then publishing extensive reports by them, often written by people who had served in the army in one capacity or another, and who were outraged by what they had witnessed, and they would then publish detailed accounts of abuses in Indochina, for example, or in both the French and Belgian Congo. La Revue Blanche published similar material, including one report about systematic abuses in one of France's military penitentiaries, as well as abuses carried out by the army in Algeria. And this was the kind of material. This was the kind of material that would not be published in the mass press, which in newspapers, which by and large towed the line on French colonial policy. So it offers an example of the importance of publications at the margins of the mass press, which have more room for maneuver and are able to write about controversial subjects and express heterodox political perspectives on those subjects. But it pertains to the way which they are at the edge of the mass press without being completely removed from it, because they are also using techniques of reportage which were developed within newspapers. They are, in a way, using the tools of the mass press to counter the mass press. They are using its own arms against the mass press. Another instance of a critique of colonial policy that was found in these publications is Alfred Jarry's riffs on news stories, which he published under the title Speculations in La Revue Blanche. Jarry did not travel to these places, but he had a very keen political intelligence, and so he would write ludic squibs about, for instance, the Boer War, or about the crimes of European colonial powers that were aided and abetted by explorer journalists such as Henry Morton Stanley, who carried out his famous voyage in Africa in search of Dr. Livingstone. And part of this body of work is a critique of the press itself and how the press was complicit in these colonial outrages. Press criticism and journalistic satire were pioneered in the Petites Revues. And these Petites Revues were the forerunners of satirical publications such as Le Canard Enchaîné, which was founded in 1915, and which constitute an essential component of a free press, a press that is willing to break with the assumption that dog must not eat dog. They are reporting on the reporters themselves. They are breaking with the code of omerta, which still today afflicts journalism of all kinds. They are willing to call the press and the mass media to account.
Speaking of Jarry, it's a handy way to sort of slip back into the timeline and come back to France. You raise, I think, quite well, Jarry and his experimentations, Ubu Roi, which a play that brings us this grotesque egg-shaped assassin who murders the king of Poland, almost a bit like Hermann Goering crossed with Falstaff, I thought, reading. Anyway, people were disgusted and confused, but it seemed to be, it's obviously a canonical play now. This is the fin de siècle, and we're heading, as we know, towards the war. Was it a sense of greyness and grimness? Was it pessimistic or optimistic as it moves into the 20th century?
Well, there is a profound sense of pessimism that infuses much of the literature of what was called the fin de siècle at the end of the 19th century. And it's particularly pronounced in the work of reactionary authors such as Léon Blois or Joris Karl Huysmans or Maurice Barrès was also a leading right-wing politician, and Jean Lorrain. The world of late 19th century Paris, as they depicted, is really going to hell in a handbasket, and they often portray that as that degradation as a consequence of the rise of journalism and of the press. So they are repeating the old Balzacian trope of journalism as prostitution, as a corrosive behemoth that is swallowing up art and culture. So they feature less prominently in Hustlers in the Ivory Tower, because I was keen to focus on those writers who, without necessarily being optimistic, are not trying to turn their backs on modernity in the same way. They may be writers such as Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Apollinaire, and Proust, and Péguy are resisting modernity without rejecting it. They recognize the way in which modernity, as embodied by the press, represents an existential challenge and a challenge to the future of literature. But they want to meet that challenge, and they want to use journalism to their own advantage. They want to incorporate it within their art. And so they are not exactly enthralled to naive optimism, but and their works often express a deeply pessimistic view of human relations, notably Proust, whose vision of love, for instance, is anything but reassuring. And yet there are these flashes of optimism that shine through their work, particularly at the end of Proust's novel, where his hero recognizes that what he has been trying to do all along is to write a novel of the self that can retrieve lost time. Similarly, Mallarmé, towards the end of his career, having previously disparaged journalism as the source of what he calls universal reportage, which he feels is corrupting all human communication, he arrives at a more optimistic, indeed enthusiastic vision of the press as a source of literary renewal. This is emblematic of the modernist attitude of this hunger for a balance between opposing forces, as opposed to a more reactionary attitude which seeks to return to a kind of past that cannot be retrieved. Whereas Proust's attitude towards time is to try and make the past come alive again within the present, to make it eternal, to allow memory to live on in the present and to be continually molded and re-inspired by the experience of the present, of modernity.
To listen to the remainder of this podcast and access bonus material into the future, please consider supporting us with a subscription.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Cassandra Voices is a multimedia project that seeks to highlight independent voices and inspire original thinking with stories from Ireland and around the world. Go to CassandraVoices.com online to read more and look out for more episodes from us in future. Your attention and your support are crucial. Thank you.